Anjem Choudhury. At 5:30 in the morning on July 17, 2023, officers from the Metropolitan Police broke down the door of a home in East London. Inside, they arrested a 56-year-old former solicitor. He was not new to them. He had already served a 5.5-year sentence for a terrorism conviction and had walked out of prison in 2018. But the case investigators had spent the previous year quietly building, working alongside the New York Police Department and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, would put him back behind bars for the rest of his life. Anjem Choudhury was born in 1967 in Ilford, East London, into a British Pakistani family. He trained as a solicitor before turning full-time to religious activism, and for more than 2 decades, he was the most visible face of a network known as Al-Muhajirun. The group had been proscribed under British terrorism law in 2010, and it had reappeared repeatedly under different names, from Islam for UK to Muslims Against Crusades, always with Choudhury near the center of its leadership. In 2016, he was convicted at the Old Bailey of inviting support for the Islamic State. He was sentenced to 5.5 years and released on license in 2018. Officials at the time described him as one of the most influential radicalizers of a generation, someone whose lectures had shaped the outlooks of young men later linked to attacks in London, Tunisia, and elsewhere. When he came out of prison, he was still subject to strict controls on his movements and communications. Officials believed those controls were being observed. Prosecutors would later argue otherwise. By the early 2020s, the founder of Al-Muhajirun, Omar Bakri Mohammed, was jailed in Lebanon. Investigators would later argue that Choudhury had quietly taken on the role of caretaker leader of the wider network. He was doing it, they said, at a distance. He gave online lectures to a group based in New York called the Islamic Thinkers Society, delivered on a video platform called Element, and used those sessions to direct members and shape the group's activities on both sides of the Atlantic. The case against him was a joint operation between the Metropolitan Police, the New York Police Department, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Undercover officers from the United States infiltrated the online lectures over the course of 2022 and 2023. Investigators assessed more than 16,000 documents and hundreds of hours of audio and video during that period. The picture they built was of a man running a proscribed terrorist organization from his home in Ilford. He was arrested at that home in July of 2023. A 29-year-old man from Edmonton in Canada, named Khalid Hussein, was arrested on the same case as a member of the same organization. How does a man who has never lifted a weapon, who has never planted a device, who has never traveled to a battlefield, end up facing a life sentence in one of the most secure prisons in Britain? The trial ran for 6 weeks at Woolwich Crown Court in the summer of 2024. Prosecuting counsel Tom Little described Choudhury as a man with a warped and twisted mindset who had spent his adult life pushing others towards violence. The jury returned its verdict on July 23rd, convicting Choudhury of directing a terrorist organization, membership of a proscribed organization, and encouraging support for it. Hussein was convicted of membership. 1 week later, on July 30th, 2024, Mr. Justice Mark Wall passed sentence. Choudhury was given a life term with a minimum of 28 years. The judge told the court that Choudhury had been front and center in the running of a terrorist organization. With time already served on remand, the earliest possible release date fell somewhere close to his 85th birthday. Hussein received 5 years. Choudhury had been held at HMP Belmarsh during earlier phases of his custody, and during his previous sentence he had been moved to a separation unit at HMP Frankland, becoming the first inmate ever placed in such a unit. In leaked recordings obtained by the broadcaster GB News in 2022, He described the separation regime as a relief because he was, in his words, only among fellow Muslims. He said prison staff were people to be ignored entirely. Choudhury took his conviction and sentence to the Court of Appeal. In 2025, 3 judges led by Lord Justice Edis rejected his challenge, describing the case as unarguable and the offending as of exceptional gravity. As of 2026, Anjem Choudhury remains in custody at a maximum security prison, still serving that life term. The next inmate on this list never operated in the public eye at all. His name barely surfaced until the Metropolitan Police finally connected 4 unexplained deaths in a small corner of East London to the same front door. Stephen Port. On June 19, 2014, a 23-year-old fashion student named Anthony Walgate was found propped against a wall outside a block of flats in Barking, East London. He had been given a lethal dose of the drug GHB. Officers arrested the man who had called the ambulance, a former chef in his late 30s named Stephen Port, but only for perverting the course of justice. Over the next 15 months, 3 more young men would be found dead in the same small stretch of streets, drugged in the same way. And Stephen Port would remain a free man. Stephen John Port was born in 1975 in Southend-on-Sea, Essex. He had worked as a chef, drifted between kitchen jobs, and eventually settled in a modest flat on Cook Street in Barking. To the men he met online, he presented an entirely different life. He told them he had served in the Royal Navy. He told them he had graduated from Oxford. Neither of those things was true. Between June of 2014 and September of 2015, Port used dating apps, primarily Grindr, to lure 4 young men to his flat. Anthony Walgate was the first. Gabriel Cavari, 22 years old, was the second. Daniel Whitworth, 21, was the third. Jack Taylor, 25, was the fourth. Each of the 4 was drugged with an overdose of GHB. Each was then sexually assaulted while unconscious. Each was then left, one after another, in or near the small churchyard at Barking Abbey, a short walk from Port's front door. In one of the cases, Port planted a fake suicide note on the body to steer the investigation away from himself. When officers finally examined his phone in full, they found around 83 videos of him assaulting other men who had been drugged to the point of losing consciousness. The investigation, in its early stages, went badly wrong. Port had been convicted in March of 2015 for perverting the course of justice around Anthony Walgate's death, and he had been jailed for 8 months. That conviction did not trigger any wider inquiry. When the second and third bodies appeared in the churchyard, officers treated the deaths as unrelated drug overdoses. Only after the family of Jack Taylor, the 4th victim, pushed the Metropolitan Police to look more closely, was the case reclassified as a series of murders. CCTV footage, taken from a shop near Barking railway station, showed Jack Taylor walking with Port on the night he died. That footage was the piece of evidence that finally broke the case open. How does one man drug, assault, and kill 4 people, all within walking distance of the same railway station, and go unchallenged for more than a year? Port was tried at the Old Bailey in the autumn of 2016. The prosecution, led by Jonathan Rees, laid out a case involving 22 offenses against 11 different men. Port had denied 29 charges. On November 23, 2016, the jury convicted him of 4 murders, 4 rapes, 4 sexual assaults, and 10 counts of administering a substance with intent. 2 days later, on November 25th, Mr. Justice Openshaw handed down a whole life order. The judge described Port as wicked and monstrous and said he had killed the 4 young men to satisfy his own desires. A whole life order means exactly what the words describe. There is no minimum term. There is no consideration for parole. Port would die in prison. He lodged an appeal against his murder convictions in 2018. The Court of Appeal dismissed it at the initial stage. He was subsequently held at HMP Belmarsh, one of the small number of facilities in Britain designated for prisoners considered too dangerous or notorious for the mainstream estate. As of 2026, his precise location within the prison system is not publicly confirmed, but his sentence remains unchanged. Parallel to Port's imprisonment, a separate story has continued to unfold. In 2021, inquests into the 4 deaths concluded that failings by the police had probably contributed to 3 of them. In November of 2023, the Independent Office for Police Conduct opened a formal investigation into 8 officers from the Metropolitan Police over the handling of the original inquiries. That investigation is still ongoing. 6 years after Port's arrest, in a small park in the center of Reading, a very different kind of attack would leave 3 friends dead within the space of a single minute. Khairi Sadallah. Just after 7 in the evening on June 20th, 2020, a group of friends were sitting on the grass in a public park in the middle of Reading. It was the first Saturday after lockdown restrictions had eased. A 25-year-old man walked up behind them, carrying an 8-inch kitchen knife. In under a minute, 3 of them were dead. The attacker ran through the park, threw the knife into a hedge, and was tackled to the ground by an off-duty officer before he had even reached the gates. What he had done that evening had taken 60 seconds. What had led him to it had been building for years. Khairi Sadallah was born in 1995 in Libya. He came to the United Kingdom in 2012 as a teenager, fleeing the Second Libyan Civil War. An inquest would later describe him as a former child soldier. He was granted asylum in 2018 and settled in Reading, where he lived alongside a growing list of diagnoses that included post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and emotionally unstable personality disorder. Between 2015 and 2019, he was convicted of around 15 separate offenses. In 2019, his name came to the attention of the security service. He was assessed as falling below the threshold for a formal investigation. That assessment would be looked at again, in painful detail, in the years that followed. Forbury Gardens sits in the heart of Reading, a green space wrapped around the ruins of a medieval abbey. On the evening of June 20th, 2020, small groups had spread out across the lawn to make the most of a warm evening at the end of a long spring of restrictions. Sadallah walked in carrying his knife. He shouted a phrase in Arabic. He then attacked a group of men who had been sitting together on the grass. 3 of them died. James Furlong was 36 years old, a teacher at a local school. Dr. David Wales was 49, a scientist. Joseph Ritchie Bennett was 39, an American who had made a home in the town. 3 others were wounded and survived. The 3 men who died had known each other for years. They had been friends. 2 of them had lived together. Sadallah was tackled to the ground by an off-duty officer within minutes of the attack ending. He was arrested initially for murder. Within hours, the Metropolitan Police re-arrested him under the Terrorism Act. How does a man known to the police for a string of previous offenses and known to the security service by name walk into a public park on a summer evening with a kitchen knife and take 3 lives in under a minute? In November of 2020, Sadallah pleaded guilty at the Old Bailey to 3 counts of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. Prosecutors told the court that he had acted to advance a political, religious, or ideological cause. His defense team argued that he had been in the grip of serious mental illness at the time of the attack. The judge would reject the more extreme versions of that defense. On January 11, 2021, Mr. Justice Sweeney imposed a whole-life order. He described the case as rare and exceptional. Alongside the whole-life term, Sadallah received concurrent 24-year sentences for the 3 attempted murders. Sadallah was held at HMP Belmarsh from the earliest stages of his case and appeared before the Court of Appeal by video link from the prison in October of 2021. That appeal, a challenge to the whole-life sentence, was dismissed. Before his arrest, his record already included assaults on emergency workers. During an arrest in 2019, he had spat in the face of a female police officer and called her a slave, an incident she later described as the worst thing she had experienced in her career. In April of 2024, an inquest presided over by the former senior judge Sir Adrian Fulford concluded that the deaths of the 3 men in Forbury Gardens had probably been avoidable. The inquest found a series of failures across multiple state agencies in the years leading up to the attack. As of 2026, Sadallah remains in custody serving the whole-life order. 2 decades before that attack in Reading, another lone man had targeted communities across London with a very different kind of weapon. David Copeland. Over 13 days in April of 1999, a former engineer's assistant on the London Underground carried 3 homemade devices packed with nails into 3 different corners of the capital. The first went off in Brixton, the second in Brick Lane, the third on the evening of April 30th at the Admiral Duncan pub in Soho. 3 people at the pub lost their lives that night. Many more were harmed. The man responsible had chosen his targets with the stated intention of setting off a race war in Britain. His name was David Copeland. Copeland was in his early 20s, from the Farnborough and Cove area of Hampshire. He had worked as an assistant to a maintenance engineer on the London Underground. In terms of political life, he had passed through the British National Party and then joined a smaller neo-Nazi group called the National Socialist Movement. Sources vary on his exact date of birth, but he was around 22 years old at the time of the campaign. He had chosen 3 communities to target. Brixton in South London held the first. Brick Lane in the East End held the second. The Admiral Duncan pub, a well-known meeting place for the LGBT community in Soho, held the third. The first device was left in Brixton on April 17, 1999. The second was left in Brick Lane on April 24th. Between them, those 2 blasts harmed 61 people. Some suffered life-changing injuries. The third device was placed inside the Admiral Duncan on the evening of April 30th. 3 people at the pub lost their lives that night. Andrea Dykes, 27 years old, had been out with friends. She was expecting her first child. John Light, 32, and Nick Moore, 31, had been there with her. All 3 had traveled up from Colchester in Essex for the evening. 79 other people at the pub were harmed by the blast. Across the whole 13-day campaign, the total figure for those harmed reached somewhere between 139 and 140. A young child was among those hurt. The investigation was led by the Metropolitan Police Anti-Terrorist Branch. On April the 29th, officers released CCTV footage of a man captured at the scene of the Brixton bombing. Within hours of that footage being aired, Copeland had been identified by people who had known him and placed under arrest. How does a lone man, without support from any organized network, plan and carry out 3 attacks in the heart of a capital city over less than 2 weeks? Copeland went on trial at the Old Bailey in the summer of 2000. His defense offered a plea to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, supported by a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia made by a consultant at Broadmoor Hospital. The prosecution rejected that plea. The jury convicted him on all counts. On June 30, 2000, he was given 6 life sentences. A High Court judge later set a minimum term of 50 years. The Court of Appeal upheld that minimum in 2011, with Mr. Justice Burton describing the case as a really exceptional case of deliberate, multiple offending of this kind. Under that minimum term, Copeland would not be eligible for parole consideration until some point in the 2050s. Copeland was moved to HMP Belmarsh after his conviction. In June of 2014, while in the exercise yard at the prison, he attacked a fellow inmate named Thomas McDonough. His weapon was a toothbrush that had been modified to hold 2 razor blades. The attack left McDonough with cuts across his face, requiring around 14 stitches. He nearly lost the sight in one eye. Officers overpowered Copeland with a baton strike to the leg. He spent the following 11 months in solitary confinement. In October of 2015, at Woolwich Crown Court, Judge Anuja Deer sentenced him to a further 3 years for that assault. She said the attack had unfolded too quickly for officers to prevent it. Copeland's location within the prison system after 2015 is disputed. He was firmly documented at Belmarsh through his time there. Later reports have suggested he was moved to HMP Frankland, but no primary source has confirmed his present location. As of 2026, he continues to serve 6 life sentences. Copeland's attack on another inmate at Belmarsh was serious, and it earned him more time behind bars. By comparison to the next name on this list, though, it was contained. The 5th Belmarsh prisoner in this list turned his violence squarely on the officers assigned to guard him. Akhlaqur Rahman. On October 23, 2022, 3 prison officers at HMP Belmarsh entered the cell of a 35-year-old inmate already serving 3 life sentences for attempted murder. He had tried to kill officers at other prisons before he arrived. He had already been placed in a segregation unit for concerns about radicalization. On that morning, he threw a bin at the officers, ran at the one closest to the door, and began attacking them with a sharpened plastic spoon. What happened inside that cell would put him in front of a jury at the Old Bailey for the 2nd time in 6 years. Akhlaqur Rahman, sometimes spelled Akhlaqar, was originally from Ipswich. He was 38 years old at his most recent trial in 2025. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His first prison sentence came at Ipswich Crown Court in November of 2015, when he was jailed for 6 years and 4 months for Class A drug offenses involving heroin and cocaine. That sentence became the beginning of a much longer and more violent chapter inside the prison estate. In 2017, while imprisoned, Rahman attacked officers and inmates at 3 separate prisons in England: HMP Wayland in Norfolk, HMP Lincoln, and HMP Wakefield. His weapons ranged from razor blades to a piece of masonry. The victims of those attacks, Derek Walker, David Sutton, Sean Humphreys, and Daniel Preston, all suffered serious head and neck injuries. One needed 28 stitches. Another sustained extensive nerve damage. At his trial for those attacks, Rahman claimed that angels had told him to kill. In 2019, at Birmingham Crown Court, he was convicted of 3 counts of attempted murder and given 3 life sentences with a minimum term of 13 years. He was subsequently moved to HMP Swaleside in Kent. There, staff placed him in a segregation unit over concerns that he was trying to draw other inmates into what officers described as extreme versions of Islam. At Swaleside, he punched officers and stabbed a member of staff named Ludovic Barbier in the forehead with a pen. Shortly afterwards, the prison service moved him to HMP Belmarsh, On October 23, 2022, 3 officers entered his cell. Their names were Elizabeth Franklin, John Clark, and Robert Salter. According to the case that would later be laid out in court, Rahman picked up the bin in his cell and threw it. He then ran at Officer Franklin, shouting a phrase that translated as "death to the non-believers," a term he used to describe the officers. In his hand, he had a piece of plastic that had been sharpened, fashioned from a spoon. He used it to attack the officers around the head and neck. What does it take for the prison service to consider a single inmate too dangerous to be managed inside any prison in the country? Rahman appeared at the Old Bailey in January of 2025. Prosecuting counsel Alistair Richardson told the jury that Rahman had said repeatedly that he wanted to kill prison officers. Rahman's defense argued that voices had told him to fight, and that his hope had been for the officers to kill him in return. The jury convicted him of 4 counts of attempted murder. Rahman also admitted attempted woundings, 6 counts of attempted assault on emergency workers, and possession of a sharpened plastic weapon. Mrs. Justice McGowan imposed a hospital order without limit of time. She told Rahman that he was mentally unwell and needed treatment. In the 2 years leading up to his sentencing, he had been held at Rampton Secure Hospital, where his condition had been described as stable while on medication. As of 2026, Rahman is detained at Rampton under that hospital order, with no fixed endpoint. No appeal against his conviction or sentence has been reported. If you're finding these cases interesting, take a second to hit subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel keep going, and it means you won't miss what comes next. Ahmed Hassan. On the morning of September 15, 2017, at just before 8:30, a supermarket carrier bag sitting on the floor of a District Line train partially exploded as the train pulled into Parsons Green Station in West London. The device inside was a homemade bomb built with the explosive TATP, packed with metal shrapnel, and set on a timer. It had not gone off fully. Had it done so, investigators would later say, there would almost certainly have been fatalities on the platform and inside the carriage. The man who had built it was living in Sunbury-on-Thames with a foster family, and on paper, he was still being processed as a teenage asylum seeker. Ahmed Hassan, whose full name is Ahmed Hassan Mohammed Ali, was an Iraqi asylum seeker who had entered the United Kingdom in 2015. He had told immigration officials he was 16 years old. A judge would later find that he had lied about his age. He was placed with foster parents in Sunbury-on-Thames, in Surrey, who did not know the full picture of who they had taken in. In January of 2016, during a formal interview, he had told immigration officials that he had been in contact with the Islamic State in Iraq and had been trained to kill. He blamed the United Kingdom for the death of his father in Iraq. Hassan built the bomb inside his foster family's home while his foster parents were away. On the morning of September 15, 2017, he traveled to Wimbledon and boarded a westbound District Line train, carrying the device in a supermarket carrier bag. He left the bag on the floor of the carriage and stepped off the train before it reached Parsons Green. When the train pulled into the platform, the device partially detonated, sending a fireball through the carriage. Contemporaneous reporting on the day of the attack put the number of injured at 30. By the time the case reached trial and sentencing the following year, the figure cited in court had risen to 51. Nobody had been killed. Had the bomb detonated as designed, investigators told the court, the toll would almost certainly have looked very different. Hassan was tried at the Old Bailey and convicted of attempted murder on March 16, 2018. How does a young man who arrived in the country as an asylum seeker end up building a viable explosive device inside his foster parents' home and planting it on a rush-hour train? Mr. Justice Haddon Cave passed sentence on March 23, 2018. Hassan received a life sentence with a minimum term of 34 years. The judge told the court that Hassan had quietly gone about planning and executing the attack with ruthless determination and something close to military efficiency, all while presenting himself outwardly as a model asylum seeker. He described Hassan as a dangerous and devious individual. Hassan was moved to HMP Belmarsh, where he was housed on Spur 4 of the high security unit. At the time, the Spur held only 10 inmates. Among them were Hashem Abedi, the surviving conspirator behind the Manchester Arena attack, and a third inmate named Muhammad Saeed. On May 11, 2020, the three of them attacked prison officer Paul Edwards inside the unit. Officer Edwards was 57 years old. CCTV footage from the wing, later shown at trial, captured the three inmates smiling and joking together before breaking into a run to reach him. Edwards suffered a scalp laceration, bruising, and lasting damage to his hearing and other senses. In February of 2022, at Woolwich Crown Court, all three men were convicted over the attack on Officer Edwards. Hassan received an additional 3 years to run consecutively with his existing sentence. During those proceedings, he told the judge that he hated him. He was subsequently transferred out of Belmarsh and moved to HMP Frankland in County Durham. Hassan challenged his conviction at the Court of Appeal. That challenge was rejected, though the court did agree to a small technical adjustment to his sentence, deducting 182 days on account of time already spent on remand. As of 2026, he remains at Frankland, still serving the life term handed down at the Old Bailey. The next Belmarsh inmate on this list committed his offenses over the span of almost 2 decades, largely against people who had no ability to defend themselves. Delroy Grant. Between October of 1992 and May of 2009, a serial burglar and sex attacker moved through the streets of southeast London, Kent, and Surrey in the small hours of the morning. The victims were always the same kind of people: elderly, largely women, and living alone. Some of them were in their 80s, some of them were in their 90s. By the time the Metropolitan Police finally caught him, the number of offenses officially linked to him stood at 203. The detective who ran the case would later say that the true figure was probably closer to 600. Delroy Easton Grant was born on September 3, 1957, in Kingston, Jamaica. He came to Britain and eventually settled in Honor Oak in South London. He worked for a period as a minicab driver. He was the father of at least 8 children. In the years leading up to his arrest, he was also the full-time carer for his estranged wife, Jennifer, who had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. To his neighbors and to the wider world, he presented as a devoted family man. The pattern of the offending was consistent enough that officers gave it a code name. Operation Minstead, launched in 1998, would go on to become the largest serial sex attack investigation ever run by the Metropolitan Police. The offender would break into the homes of elderly people in the early hours of the morning, often disabling the electricity supply before entering, and would then subject his victims to burglary and, in many cases, serious sexual assault. Officers realized over time that they were dealing with a single man committing offenses over a very wide geographical area. The investigation ran for years without a suspect. Officers tested the DNA of more than 2,000 men. They used ancestral DNA profiling in an attempt to narrow the search. In 1999, one significant investigative error allowed the offender to continue committing crimes for years afterwards. According to reporting at the time of his conviction, A further 146 offenses were linked to him after that mistake. The case was eventually broken through surveillance. Officers had identified a Vauxhall Zafira they believed was being used by the attacker. On a night in November of 2009, that vehicle was spotted, and Grant was arrested at around 2 in the morning. How does a single man, operating alone, commit hundreds of offenses against elderly people over a period of 17 years in one of the most heavily policed cities in the world? Grant went on trial at Woolwich Crown Court, where he denied 29 charges spanning 1992 to 2009. Those charges included burglary, rape, and indecent assault. On March 24, 2011, the jury found him guilty on all 29 counts. Those convictions related to a total of 18 individual victims. The judge, Peter Rook, imposed 4 life sentences with a minimum term of 27 years. He told Grant that his depravity knew no bounds, and that he had blighted the remaining years of his victims' lives. The former head of the investigation, Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton, told reporters after the sentencing that the 203 offenses on the official record were only part of the picture, and that the real figure could easily be double or triple that number. The Metropolitan Police issued a formal apology for the missed chances to catch him earlier in the offending. Grant was moved into the high-security prison estate, including HMP Belmarsh. No documented incidents involving him and prison staff have surfaced in reporting since his conviction. Under the minimum term he was given, he will not be considered for parole until he is in his 80s. As of 2026, he remains in custody. The next case in this series involves a single act of violence, over in seconds, but committed in a place where it was arguably never meant to be possible. Louis de Zoysa. In the early hours of September 25, 2020, a police custody sergeant named Matt Ratana was on duty at the Croydon Custody Centre in South London when a handcuffed suspect brought in for possession of ammunition was seated on a bench inside the holding area. The suspect had already been searched twice by officers on the street. Both of those searches had missed a loaded antique revolver concealed in an underarm holster beneath his clothes. Within minutes of arriving at the custody center, still in handcuffs, the suspect drew that revolver and shot the 54-year-old sergeant in the chest at near point-blank range. Sergeant Ratana died in hospital a short time later. The gunman was Louis de Zoysa. De Zoysa was born in Croydon into a Roman Catholic family of Sri Lankan and British descent. He was the eldest of 5 children. He attended John Fisher School in Purley, went on to study at University College London, and graduated with a degree in engineering. He had worked as a data analyst for HM Revenue and Customs. He had been diagnosed as autistic at the age of 13. School records showed a long-standing interest in weapons, and he had designed weapons on school computers. His name had been referred to the Prevent program years earlier, but no formal investigation had followed, and he was not known to the security service. At the time of the shooting, he was living in a flat on a farm in Banstead, in Surrey. On the evening of September 24, 2020, de Zoysa was stopped and searched in Norbury in South London. Officers found cannabis on him. They also found ammunition. What they did not find, despite 2 searches, was the loaded antique revolver he was carrying in an underarm holster beneath his clothing. He had bought that revolver online several months earlier. Because of its age, it fell into a category of antique firearms that could be sold legally in the United Kingdom. He was taken to the Croydon Custody Centre on Windmill Road. Around midnight, still handcuffed behind his back, he was seated in the holding area to be processed. Sergeant Matt Ratana was the officer on duty. What happened next was captured in full on the custody center's own CCTV cameras and on the body-worn footage of the officers present. DeZoisa fired 4 shots. The first 2 struck Sergeant Ratana, one of them fatally. A later shot struck DeZoisa himself in the neck, causing a stroke and permanent brain damage. The Independent Office for Police Conduct opened an investigation into how the loaded revolver had been missed during the earlier searches on the street. How does a suspect, handcuffed and inside a police custody center, produce a loaded firearm and shoot the officer responsible for booking him in? DeZoisa's trial was moved from the Old Bailey to Northampton Crown Court in order to be closer to the secure hospital where he was being held. Because of his injuries, he communicated with the court by writing on a whiteboard. His defense argued that he had been experiencing an autistic breakdown or a panic attack at the moment of the shooting, and that his responsibility was therefore diminished. Dr. Nigel Blackwood, giving evidence for the prosecution, told the jury that DeZoisa had been thinking very clearly at the time of the shooting. On June 23, 2023, the jury found him guilty of murder. He was sentenced at the same court on July 27, 2023. Mr. Justice Jeremy Johnson imposed a whole life order. The judge told DeZoisa that he had acted in cold blood and that his autism was not to blame for what he had done. He became, according to the BBC's reporting at the time, the 65th person then serving a whole life order in England and Wales. The BBC reported that DeZoisa would serve his sentence at HMP Belmarsh. In 2024, the Court of Appeal, sitting under Dame Victoria Sharp, dismissed his challenges to both his conviction and his sentence. A separate inquest into the shooting in November of 2023 examined the failed searches. In the aftermath of the case, custody staff working across the estate began wearing body armor. The Belmarsh inmate, whose story comes next, also killed his victim inside a room designed to feel safe. In his case, the room was a Methodist church hall, and the victim was a serving member of Parliament. Ali Harbi Ali. On the afternoon of October 15, 2021, a 69-year-old member of Parliament named Sir David Ames was holding a constituency surgery inside the Belfairs Methodist Church Hall in Leigh-on-Sea, Essex. It was the kind of routine appointment that MPs across the country hold every Friday. A man in his mid-20s had booked in as a constituent under the false pretense of being a new NHS worker moving into the area. When he was shown into the room where Ames was working, he took out a knife and stabbed the MP more than 20 times. He had spent years planning to kill a politician. He had researched several before deciding on Ames, and he had walked in through the front door of the church hall with the weapon on his person. Ali Harbi Ali was born on February 1, 1996. He was a British citizen of Somali heritage. His father, Harbi Ali Kulan, had once served as a media advisor to a Somali prime minister. At the time of the attack, he was living with his aunt in Kentish Town in North London. His schooling had been in Croydon at Riddlesdown Collegiate. In October of 2014, when he was still in school, he had been referred to the Prevent program by staff. He had then been placed briefly on the Channel Intervention program, which was designed to steer young people away from radicalization. He had been exited from the program in April of 2015, and his case had been closed with a rating of low risk. His name had not been passed to the security service. Behind that closed file, however, Ali had spent years plotting attacks. Later evidence would show that he had conducted reconnaissance on a number of members of Parliament, including the former cabinet minister Michael Gove, before settling on Sir David Ames. His stated motive was revenge for Ames's votes in support of British airstrikes on Syria. To reach Ames, he made a false appointment for the constituency surgery, posing as a new NHS worker moving to the Leigh-on-Sea area. On the afternoon of October 15, 2021, he entered the Belmarsh Methodist Church Hall, was shown into the meeting room, and attacked a mess with a knife. He was arrested at the scene. How does a young man once flagged to a government de-radicalization program, and then quietly closed as low risk, go on to spend years planning to kill members of parliament in their own constituency surgeries? Ali was tried at the Old Bailey in the spring of 2022. The jury deliberated for approximately 18 minutes. On April 11, 2022, he was convicted of the murder of Sir David Amess and of preparing acts of terrorism. 2 days later, on April 13, Mr. Justice Sweeney imposed a whole life order. The judge told the court that Ali had shown no remorse or shame for what he had done, and that the killing was one that had struck at the heart of British democracy. In the judge's assessment, the case fell squarely into the category for which whole-life orders had been designed. Ali was held on remand at HMP Belmarsh from the earliest stages of his case, and appeared at earlier hearings by video link from the prison. His post-conviction location has not been officially confirmed. In the years after his sentencing, the case became the subject of 2 separate reviews of the failings that had preceded the attack. In February of 2025, the Prevent Learning Review into Ali's case was published. It concluded that his file had been closed too soon and identified a series of errors in the handling of his case. Lady Julia Amess, the widow of Sir David, told reporters that she was pleased that the failures were finally in the public domain. Later in 2025, the Anderson Review, led by Lord Anderson of Ipswich, identified a string of further failures. The family called for a full public inquiry. The Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, rejected that call. Katie Amos, the MP's daughter, described the decision as insulting. On October 15, 2025, 4 years to the day after the attack, the family issued a statement saying that they remained without answers. As of 2026, Ali Harbi Ali continues to serve the whole life order. The final name on this list belongs to a much more recent case, and one that produced not 1 but 3 whole life orders at a single sentencing hearing. Kyle Clifford. On the evening of July 9, 2024, at a family home in the quiet Hertfordshire town of Bushey, a former British soldier arrived at the front door carrying a bag. Inside the bag were a crossbow and a knife. Inside the house were 3 women, a mother and her 2 adult daughters. Within the space of a few hours, all 3 would be dead. The killer had once dated one of the daughters. Their father, a well-known BBC racing commentator named John Hunt, was away from the house at the time. The attack was, prosecutors would later argue, fueled by an ideology of violent misogyny that the killer had been consuming online in the hours leading up to his arrival. Kyle Clifford was born on April 5, 1998. He was from Enfield in North London and had served for a period as a British soldier. His older brother, Bradley Clifford, had been jailed for life in 2017 for a separate murder. On the evening of July 9, 2024, Clifford arrived at the Hunt family home in Bushey. He gained entry to the house by pretending to be there to return belongings to his ex-girlfriend, Louise Hunt. Inside the house, he attacked her mother, Carol Hunt, who was 61 years old and married to the BBC commentator John Hunt. Carol Hunt was killed with a knife. Clifford then waited inside the house. When Louise Hunt returned home, he restrained her, falsely imprisoned her using duct tape, and raped her. He then killed her with the crossbow. Louise Hunt was 25 years old. Shortly afterwards, her sister Hannah Hunt, who was 28, came home. Clifford killed her with the crossbow as well, He left the property with the crossbow concealed under a sheet, captured on CCTV as he did so. A manhunt began the following day. Digital evidence recovered later showed that Clifford had made internet searches checking the movements of John Hunt in the days leading up to the attack, and that he had spent time the previous night watching content produced by the online influencer Andrew Tate. The manhunt ended in a cemetery in North London the next day. As officers closed in, Clifford turned the crossbow on himself. He survived, but the injury left him paralyzed from the chest down. What does it say about a man that, having planned and carried out the killing of 3 women, he refuses, without exception, to attend any part of his own trial or his own sentencing? Clifford was charged with 3 counts of murder, false imprisonment, and 2 weapons offenses. On January 22, 2025, he pleaded guilty to the murders, the false imprisonment, and the weapons counts. He denied the rape of Louise Hunt. That charge went before a jury at Cambridge Crown Court. On March 6, 2025, that jury convicted him of the rape. He refused to attend either the trial or the sentencing, remaining in his cell for the duration of both. On March 11, 2025, Mr. Justice Joel Benathan handed down 3 whole-life orders. The judge described Clifford as a jealous man soaked in self-pity, a man who held women in utter contempt. The senior Crown Prosecution Service lawyer on the case, Lisa Kiff, described him simply as a murderer and a rapist. The prosecuting counsel at the trial, Alison Morgan, had told the court that the attack had been fueled by the violent misogyny promoted by Andrew Tate. Clifford was held on remand at HMP Belmarsh during the proceedings. It was from a cell inside Belmarsh that he refused to attend both the trial and the sentencing. His post-sentence location has not been confirmed. As of 2026, he continues to serve 3 whole-life orders, paralyzed from the chest down, with no appeal against his conviction or sentence reported. That covers the 10. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.